Good morning. This is an incredible room. I hope you've taken the time to look around and see this gathering, 500 plus people, all gathered together working for healthier places and healthier people. I just want to add my gratitude for the work that you're doing and just to say that I feel like I'm very much joined with you. If there was any place I want to be on the planet this morning, Duluth is where I'd want to be. So I live in a house with 10 women, my wife, 3 daughters, and 6 chickens. So there's a lot of love and support in that household. So when Chris and I were talking about this session this morning, we settled on 75 minutes. You'll have about 75 minutes to do this. So in a conversation with my wife afterwards, I said, I've got 75 minutes at this summit. And she said, 75 minutes? I said, yeah, 75 minutes. She said, 75 minutes, wow, 75 minutes. My 9-year-old daughter was in the other room. She's 9 going on 13. She said, wow, Dad, 75 minutes, you better say something interesting. And my 6-year-old twins, who share a brain, chimed in together. Yeah, Dad, you better say something interesting. So I spent the rest of the day with the chickens. Just suffice it to say that I'm not going to talk at you for 75 minutes. I do want to share a story with you, but we'll take periodic breaks and allow you to talk a little bit with one another. But I want to begin by acknowledging the privilege that we all have to be here together this morning. There are no doubt others who could be here, who probably should be here, who for one reason or another can't be, and I'd ask that you keep them in mind, especially those who are most adversely affected by the issues that we're here to discuss. We certainly don't want to speak for them, but I'd ask that we just keep their voices, their faces, their interests in view as we proceed. And I also want to take a moment just to acknowledge my own privilege, my own unearned privilege as a white, straight, formally educated man who no doubt has benefited just from the accident of my birth to have certain doors open for me along the way, including this one. And my hope is that anything that I say, anything that I do this morning throughout today can somehow contribute to a more just, loving, and life-affirming world. So if you ask anyone who knows me, they'll tell you that I'm a network nerd, and that's a title that I wear very proudly. You see, for me, networks are not just a thing. They're not just a strategy. They're not just a passing fad. For me, networks are the very currency of life. And I've been drawn to supporting state and regional food networks because I believe that our very survival and our humanity depend on it. And I feel like I'm in a room with a few kindred spirits. You're here because you care about food access, about healthy food, about healthy people, about healthy places, about justice. And you get networks. I know that you do, even if you don't think that you do. Networks are so natural to us that often we aren't even really thinking about them. They're certainly much more natural to us than, say, many of the organizational bureaucratic structures that we deal with day to day. There's evidence that shows that we are constantly navigating and networking around these structures to get things done. And that's not rebelliousness per se. That's just life doing what life wants and needs to do. Networks are often the real story about how things get done, about how we learn, how we innovate, and how we make change. Life is networked. It thrives on connection. And you know this because you're alive. At least it looks that way. And when you're not feeling alive, it's often because you're disconnected, cut off in some form or fashion from other people, from the natural world, or from your own nature, from your deeper values or a sense of purpose. Life thrives on connection at all levels. You know this. We know this. And you also know that while our starting points are different, our fates are very much connected. And that really is the fundamental call for thinking and working in networked ways. And it's not a new invitation. It's an invitation that is ages old, but seems to require periodic refreshment. 52 years ago, from that Birmingham jail cell, the Reverend Martin Luther King authored that letter where he wrote, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be." This, he wrote, is the interrelated reality of life. We know this. And yet what plays out in many of our communities seems to run counter to this wisdom that we all carry. And so the question that I want to bring to our time this morning is, how can we take what we know to be true to heart? How can we bring it deeply into our practice? How can we reconnect to life and liveliness for the sake of justice and more sustainable communities? And to bring this all down to earth, I want to share with you a story about a visionary and brave group of people that I've had the privilege to partner with over the past 4 years. This group is trying to create a new New England, a region built on new definitions of health and prosperity. So once upon a time, there was a man named Brian Donahue. And you can see from his picture here, he's a fairly serious fellow. He's an agricultural historian and a farmer. He farms on the outskirts of Boston. And a few years ago, Brian started asking questions about land use in our region and wondering how much land might be put back into production so that we could grow more food. The catalyst for Brian's thinking were his concerns about climate change, as well as concerns about economic uncertainty and what those combined forces might do to disrupt our national and global food supply. Well, Brian's questions attracted a small band of academic researchers and writers who brought their own questions about food insecurity, about nutrition-based diseases, and how growing more food in our region might be a solution to those. You see, in New England, we're in a fairly precarious position. We produce just a fraction of our food. The vast majority of our land, perhaps up to 95% of it, is not in production. And of the land that is in production, it's under constant threat of development. Our fisheries are in decline. Fishermen and fishing communities are struggling to survive. And food insecurity in our region hovers anywhere between 10 and 16%. In the state of Maine, 1 in 4, 25% of all children are food insecure. Well, Brian believed that we could and we must produce more of our own food. And they created a report called A New England Food Vision. And in that vision, they put forth a suggestion that we could reasonably produce at least 50% of what they called clean, fair, just, and accessible food for all New Englanders by the year 2060. Well, in 2012, because of my work with the states of Vermont and Rhode Island, helping them create statewide networks for food security, and food production, I was invited to attend a regional summit in Burlington, Vermont, the second annual New England Food Summit, where Brian and the writing team were to unveil their work. And I distinctly remember driving from Boston that day, where I lived at the time, cutting across the region through New Hampshire, on into Vermont, taking in the beautiful landscape that June day, feeling just exhilarated by the mountains and the hills, the beauty at that time of year. And so by the time I got to that room at the University of Vermont, I was feeling quite excited about the possibility, thinking about the possibility of returning New England to the spirit of regionalism that had been lacking, the idea of uniting diverse interests and issues to work for a more just and sustainable region. Surely, I thought, surely food could be the great unifier. Now, I should say that nobody in that room thought that a report alone would incite the kind of revolution that we were looking for and thought that we required. But that said, I'm not sure that anybody anticipated the tone of the conversation that ensued once that vision was put on the table. There was some initial good conversation and questions about, well, how much land could we put aside? How much could we put back in production? And what percentage of food should we strive to produce and still count ourselves sustainable and not overly vulnerable? But then things got really interesting. I had noticed that a number of people sitting at tables had started to stand and move to the periphery of the room, perhaps just stretching their legs. And then I noticed that a number of them were pacing, looking quite agitated. And suddenly a hand shot up from the periphery, and before he was even recognized, one of our North Country farmers leaned in and said, "Who do you think you are to tell us what we should grow?" So Tom Kelly, the convener of that summit, calmly responded and said, "Look, we're not here to tell anybody what to grow. We're just proposing a few different scenarios." And no sooner had he finished that explanation when a farmer advocate from our region stood at his table, reddening in the face, and said, "And you're telling us what clean, good food is? For real? All you organic people want to do is put us out of business." Somebody else then shot up from another part of the room and said, "Look, my family has been growing food for 4 generations. You want to come stand in my fields for a while?" And it rolled on. I heard some priceless commentary that was not shared publicly from neighboring tables, including one hushed comment, "What is this, socialism?" And somebody else saying, "The next thing they're going to say is that we can't eat meat." And to be truthful, the vision does say we should cut down on our meat consumption. Well, eventually things did cool down a little bit once we took a break, and I watched as people went to different parts of the room in little contingencies and factions, some talking in hushed tones. And my friend Karen Spiller from Boston came and found me, and we commiserated for a little while. And she confided in me, "There's no way I'm going to share right now that this room is almost entirely white." The remarkable thing is that despite that hostility, or you know what, maybe because of it, some people left that room still seeing the possibility, the eternal optimists. Perhaps they understood the old saying that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. And third, it's accepted as being self-evident. Well, the writing team certainly took their lumps, but they went right back to work working on a revision of the vision. And perhaps most importantly, a few funders and other advocates banded together and said, "It is time for us to invest in a network, in a collaborative structure and a collaborative process to move this region forward." So what exactly did that mean? How do you create a regional food network? How do you take these diverse states, these diverse interests, these different needs, and try and build this common sense of commitment? Honestly, we didn't know, but we knew that it had to be done. And why? Why a network? Because the scale and the complexity of the system that we need to change is so much larger than the purview of any single actor or organization. Because the problems that we face are fundamentally interdependent when you think about land use and health equity and nutrition and racism. Because there is so much knowledge and wisdom that already exists in our region that's just not being connected. People are working, many of them in isolation, and because clearly there's a need to build some goodwill. So in 2012, Food Solutions New England was born out of this moment, and my organization was hired to create collaborative infrastructure for a regional food network. Now, I know that every context is unique. You can't just take what worked over here and bring it over here. So this was going to have to be a very emergent process. And I also knew that that can create considerable anxiety for many people. So what we did is we put in some handrails to guide the process along. Over the past 25 years, my organization has created a number of core frameworks and practices that we put in place to help guide the design and the facilitation of complex change efforts. What you see here is what we call our lens for collaborative capacity building. And through it, we invite leaders and groups to do three things. Firstly, to focus on building connections and relationships every step of the way, to do that constantly, continuously. Secondly, to surface, understand, and shift power dynamics. Power is always at play. Power is always at play. And thirdly, as Chris mentioned earlier, to embrace love as a force for social transformation. And using this lens, we have seen groups time and time again gain confidence, overcome challenges, and make real progress. Another handrail that we put into place was at least a provisional network structure composed of a number of groups surrounding the convening entity at the University of New Hampshire. This structure included a few key roles that you see here on this slide. Some people concentrating on coordination and communications, some tending to the overall process of design and facilitation, and a group that we called the Network Design Team, a group of 30 people from around the region who represented diverse geographic, cultural, gender, age, and sectoral perspectives, who brought with them their own connections to networks around the region. And their job was to help us weave this network to continue to build goodwill and buy-in around New England. And with this structure in place, we then took a cue from the poets. And in particular, the poet William Stafford and his beautiful piece, A Ritual to Read to Each Other. The opening stanza of that poem goes like this. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made will prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we will miss our star. As a facilitator, I've seen time and again how groups can inherit dynamics that were not of their own making and perpetuate them, stepping into roles almost as if they're in a play, and without some kind of mindfulness and really seeing one another, they just play out the same thing over and over again. I remember the first meeting of the network team, which we held in New Hampshire. Now, these were 30 people who had voluntarily said, yes, I want to be on that team, and they'd driven far and wide to get to Durham, New Hampshire. And as people entered the room, there was already evidence that some people were carrying with them what I like to call folded arms syndrome. That is, they came in with this ever so slight degree of aloofness, some of them clearly exhibiting this attitude of, I'm not sure about this, you're going to have to prove this is worth my time. Is that familiar to anybody? Oh, yes. So what do you do? What do you do to help people warm up and lean in? As a facilitator, I've learned over time that it's important to take the mirror and turn it right back on people and let them generate the draw. And so what we began to do was build trust. Build trust. Now, I don't need to tell you about the importance of trust. This is really what makes a network work. While trust is certainly important in all groups and any kind of collaborative endeavor, for me anyway, in networks, trust is fundamental. It's what allows so-called network effects to take hold. It's what allows the acceleration of learning and sharing across boundaries. It's what encourages generosity that creates the abundance in networks that leads to the growing of the pie of resources. And it's what helps to create spontaneous collaborations, those kinds of partnerships that we don't anticipate that can add so much value to what we're doing. Trust is what allows people and networks to have conversations that get to the heart of the matter and to take bigger risks that yield much higher impact. So the network team met every other month, and we do so for at least a day because we knew that building trust takes time. Our meetings were built around meals, a chance for people to break bread and be in conversation informally. And more formally, we engaged in one of my most favorite activities, which is storytelling. Who doesn't love a good story? Stories have this wonderful sticky quality and staying power. So with that network team, and actually with any network with which I work, I do an opening exercise where I invite people to tell their life story in 7 minutes. The question is generally, tell me the story that explains your presence in this room today. Everybody gets that opportunity. People do it in trios. The other two people are just asked to listen, to just pay attention. And at the end of those 7 minutes, they're invited to reflect back the values and strengths that they've heard in that story. Now, when I introduced that exercise in New Hampshire, there was at least one moan and a few rolling eyes. But I can tell you that in 7 years of doing this exercise, it never fails to deliver. People emerged with these relaxed faces, ruddy cheeks, almost as if they'd come out of a sauna. I asked them, how was that? And one woman said with just a deep sigh, that was wonderful. How so, I asked. It was wonderful, she said. It was wonderful to hear these stories. It was wonderful to share my story. It was wonderful to be in this kind of conversation in a meeting. People have that deep desire to be heard and talk about the things that deeply motivate them. Beyond storytelling, we also made time for people to share and make announcements, share updates about what was happening in their respective work from around the region. And occasionally we created these more intimate spaces for people to talk deeply about the challenges that they faced. And the expression of that kind of vulnerability can really accelerate trust in groups. We also spent time in the network team building alignment, clarity and alignment. So I want to take a moment here just to do a pop quiz in this room. And I'm going to invite you to shout out the answers. How many dollars would you say is an expensive meal for two? 100, I hear. 300, I hear. 25, I hear over there. Question 2, how many people make a crowd? Shout it out. 3. Wow, what's this? What else? 50. 20. 3, 20, 50. Third question, how many minutes make a meeting late? Whoa, I think I heard 1, 5, and 20. So, what accounts for those differences? Perspective, values, cultures, right? So just imagine when you're talking about things that really, really matter. We had to work diligently with that network team to build alignment around language. We actually created a shared glossary of terms. What do we mean by food? What do we mean by food system? What do we mean by food insecurity? What did we mean by New England? That was good, hard work. We also developed a shared understanding about what the regional vision was meant to be. A catalyst, not a prescription. And we helped people to understand what the purpose of the network was. Something that was being injected into the system to add value, not compete, to connect what was already working. The hope of all of that hard work over a year's time is that that kind of understanding, that kind of alignment, that kind of trust would ripple out into the region. So in June of 2013, we held the Regional Food Summit in Portland, Maine. And that year I was the overall facilitator for the event, which included our ever-resilient writing team, God love them, on stage. I have to tell you, I had asked that we have seating like this, and somehow that message was lost. They had stadium seating, people sitting in rows, fixed seating. So there they were under the glaring lights with all eyes on them. I facilitated the sharing and response and questions around the vision. And I noticed that year, comments were notably less contentious than the year before. But I have learned as a Midwesterner, it's hard to read a New England audience. But over time, it seemed that the questions had petered out. No damage. And so I turned to the writing team that was on the stage to thank them. Good network practice, by the way. And specifically what I said is, I want to thank you all for helping to fire the imagination of a region. And much to my surprise, everybody in the audience was on their feet, giving a standing ovation. Hoots and hollers even. I turned and looked at the writing team, and 2 of the members were crying. Well, throughout that summit, there was unsolicited testimony offered from the floor from North Country farmers saying, we get it. We've got something that you need. You've got something that we need. Clearly, we need to work together on this. We saw some unusual, and I will say even bizarre, partnerships starting to form between hardcore community organizers in Boston and people up in New Hampshire working on farm policy. And I watched as the network team took all of this in, clearly with pride, noting that they had tilled the soil for something new to take root in the region. So I want to pause here and invite you to talk to one another at your tables. I want to invite you specifically to think about a moment where trust was present in your network or your collaborative work. Talk a little bit about what that looked like, what it felt like, what enabled that trust, and also talk about what more you can do to build trust and alignment in your collaborative work. So if you want to do that as a whole table, you can do that in pairs, trios, split into 3s or 4s, about 10 minutes for this, all right? Turn to one another, please. So 1 more minute, folks. 1 minute. Grab the mics. Okay. All right, folks, welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Stop networking, folks. Come on back. Created a monster. So I want to see if there are 2 comments from the floor. Anything that conversation you just had now, stimulated you want to share with the group? An aha, an insight, a question? Anybody? 2 mics here. Anybody? Right here.
We talked about how establishing trust feels like it comes from vulnerability. And so most of the time, trust takes a long time because it takes us a really long time to be vulnerable. But that if you can get to that vulnerable place quickly, then that's how you can build trust fast.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? We're good? Last chance? Right here.
We were talking about having shared values. So if you're trying to network with somebody, even if it's within your agency, like I work at a CAP agency, so we have WIC and Head Start, Crisis Nursery, and we do SNAP outreach, so we're always trying to get them, other fellow coworkers to, of course, talk about SNAP so we can get more people that wonderful benefit. But if you don't have the same goal, then it's really hard for them to trust you that we're all working together to do that. So that's what I think it is, and listening to what it is that they need to meet their goals for their job so that can help us meet our goals, but we're trying to get more people on SNAP.
That's great. That's great. So looking for those synergies in networks. What are we trying to do respectively? How does my success connect to your success is a great question, and looking at the values that underline that. Last comment, yes?
Yeah, I wanted to mention this just because I think our situation's a little more unique. One of the things we're trying to figure out is how one establishes network in isolated rural communities. And so that's just real important to us without having resources to the larger cities and the groups and the monies that are available there, and being somewhat isolated with a very small population.
That's great. I would love to talk to you more about that. I'm doing some work in northern Maine and northern New Hampshire, very isolated communities that are looking to do that too. I'd love to hear what you're learning and share what we're learning up there. All right. So we were in Maine. So just at the tail end of that regional food summit in Maine, my friend Karen Spiller, who I introduced you to earlier, the one from Boston, came running up to me and she said, look, we have to talk. Where'd she go? Karen, you're up here somewhere. Karen had been in a breakout group where a small contingency, a multiracial contingency, was saying, look, we need to make conversations about race and racism much more central to this gathering. And if we don't do that, that actually runs counter to the vision. So Karen and I mobilized the swarm. We got the network team together, and we agreed that we needed to have a conversation, that this was an important opportunity. So while state delegations were meeting, we sat with that contingency and had a very robust conversation, the outcome of which was the network team saying, this is the moment, we need to be much more public, much more formal about this conversation and commitment to racial equity. We had no idea what that meant. We had no idea what that would look like, But based on the trust that we built together, we knew that we could, we must figure it out together. So I want to provide just a little bit of context for New England. New England, like the rest of our country, is plagued by racial disparities across almost every food system-related indicator. Depending on where you live in the region, the state population is anywhere between 70 and 94% white. But when you disaggregate the data, people of color are vastly overrepresented when we look at rates of food insecurity, obesity, diabetes, and of course, this is related to disparities in rates of unemployment, poverty, the racial wealth gap, differences in rates of home and land ownership, and access to capital, looking across the system. To quote one person in that ad hoc meeting at the summit, we can't talk about a region being whole and healthy while ignoring this reality. And so we started looking long and hard at the data and also listening to stories of discrimination in our region. Whoa, going backwards. This is Vera Francis. She's been a member of our network team, and she's been on the front lines of the Passamaquoddy tribe's work to protect their right to fish in northern Maine. That fight has intensified around just fundamental food sovereignty, so much so that she's had to step away from our group. Over the past few years, the glass eel fishery has become much more valuable to non-tribal people. And as a result, the Passamaquoddy have seen major encroachment once again on their fishing grounds. So in the last couple of years, the tribe has stepped up its efforts to defend that fishery. Glass eels are sacred in their culture. Well, Maine's governor has retaliated over the past few years, first rescinding a 4-year-old executive order that said the tribes would be consulted on any state decision that affected Native people. Then he suspended a Truth and Reconciliation Commission aimed at uncovering what was happening to Wabanaki children and families in the Maine child welfare system. And most recently, the governor also ordered the tribe's fishing gear to be confiscated. This is Marilyn Moore, my dear friend Marilyn Moore, who's also a member of the network team. And since joining Food Solutions New England, she was elected state senator representing Bridgeport, Connecticut, one of the most segregated communities in our region. Part of what drew Marilyn to Food Solutions in the first place was the connection between food and public health. Prior to becoming senator, Marilyn ran something called the Witness Project, which she actually created after experiencing directly and observing differential treatments of women of color and white women when going to doctors. Because of biased treatment, many African American women in her community were avoiding hospitals altogether, avoiding mammograms, and they were seeing these bizarre patterns play out where nutritional advice around cancer prevention and care was being given to white women, but not to African American women. So the Witness Project was created for women of color to band together and advocate, to go en masse and ask for what was rightfully theirs. Well, I was with Marilyn in Hartford, Connecticut just a few weeks ago for a retreat with some young leaders in our food system. And we set up a lunch with a senator. With remarkable good humor, Marilyn shared story after story about what she's up against as one of the few African American women senators in Connecticut. Over the summer, she shared, and she has asked me to share this story widely, she shared that she was invited to speak at a child nutrition program, and she was sitting in this waiting area when a nice young white woman came into that area and said, "I'm looking for Senator Moore." And Marilyn stood up and said, "I'm the senator." And the woman glared back at her without much humor and said, "Seriously, I'm looking for the senator." Marilyn, ever smiling, said, "I'm the senator." It took her repeating that phrase 4 times before she was actually let in to speak. The thing she said, still saying, smiling, is she never even gave me an apology. 2 weeks later, she was in her own community in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She'd taken her car with the government license plates to get repaired at an auto mechanic. And she'd gone to the restroom and came out momentarily, not noticed, to overhear two young African-American men having a conversation. They were placing a bet about whether Marilyn was the driver or the aide. She said, "I'm the senator." She said, "I'm the only senator in Connecticut that runs around the state saying, 'I'm the senator, I'm the senator.'" Now, while many of us who experience directly or hear these stories feel like it is time to rally this region, somehow it just isn't that easy. As I travel around, as Marilyn and Karen and others travel around, we hear some of these voices. "I don't understand what race has to do with food. We're talking about farming." Or, "I live in Vermont. Everyone's white up here. Race isn't really so relevant. We can't relate." Or, "Look, it's not really about race, it's about class." Any of these voices familiar to you? Oh, yeah. So how do you respond to these voices? How do you get people to see beyond their own localized and limited views? How do you get people to see that race does matter in this work? Well, in our case, the network team has become the testing ground for this work. And we spent the next year, every meeting, trying to normalize conversations about race and racism in the food system, disaggregating data, sharing stories, talking about movements already working on these issues in the region. And we noted that, yes, other inequities exist, gender and class, but in many ways, this seems to be the most fundamental and the most difficult to get at. And you know what? If you get at it, it naturally leads to these other disparities and inequities. In addition to sharing and meeting in person, we also got to creating a virtual infrastructure, including a listserv, a Facebook page, Twitter handle. And all of that served us well during what I thought was a pretty interesting experiment we conducted called the 21-Day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge. During this challenge, we created an online opportunity for people to sign up through the Food Solutions website and commit to 21 straight days, 3 weeks of reading about, talking about, taking action around racial equity, around race and racism. And there was a voluntary appeal. People could do it if they wanted to share on this collaborative platform we set up, what they were learning, what questions came up. Not everybody shared, but some did. At the end of the day, 250 people from around the region signed up, including groups in Baltimore and Chicago. And what was pretty cool is we heard that there were colleges and high schools that picked up the challenge and did their own challenge in their communities. Now, in addition to sharing stories of discrimination and oppression, we also talked about privilege, and specifically about white privilege and how it impacts the food system. And I will never forget when we were in Hartford, Connecticut for a network team gathering when Sam the white man, I like to call him, he didn't want me to say his last name, but Sam stood and he held forth, it was planned. He laid out his own white privilege, his own inherited wealth, that allowed him to graduate from college debt-free, that allowed him to purchase land for his wife to farm, that allows him to work part-time in the nonprofit sector and to send his kids to private school. He got down to dollars and cents. At a break, Marilyn Moore came up and grabbed my elbow and she said, I have never heard a white person talk like that before. And frankly, it's that kind of truth-telling that keeps me coming back. It's that kind of truth-telling that keeps me coming back. Just to mention one other network innovation that we've created that Marilyn and Karen and their colleague Julius Kolawale are a part of, we created something called the Ambassadors Initiative, where 3 members of our network team, all people of color, are funded. They are funded to go out and do outreach in diverse communities around our region. And importantly, this is not a recruitment exercise. It's not a conversion experience. This is about sitting and listening and being in dialogue. Through these conversations, important connections have been made with groups like the NAACP of Rhode Island, the Black and Latino Caucus of Connecticut, and Migrant Justice, an organization in Vermont that's working for farm workers' rights. Well, the results of all of this work over the past 2 years have been very encouraging. We now see people around our region taking up this cause. I personally, along with some of my colleagues, have actually gone into organizations and facilitated retreats and conversations about what equity, what racial disparities have to do with their work. 3 food-related networks in the region have been inspired to take up this work of deepening their commitment to racial equity. And we've seen the network itself diversify, going from 15% people of color at our convening in 2014 to nearly 30% in 2015. And beyond the numbers, that matters because it changes the conversation. It changes the conversation when you get beyond inclusion and tokenism to actually building power. And that's something that's been positively noted by everyone in attendance, as that has helped them to see more fully the picture of the region, the work to be done, and the opportunity therein. So once again, I'm going to pause and invite you to turn to your colleagues and talk about power and privilege and how these are showing up in your networks. To the extent that power and privilege are surfacing, how is that being handled? What's the results? And what can you do better? Just turn to your partners. So 1 more minute, folks. 1 minute. 1 minute. All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. Once again, we have a couple of mics and would love to hear if there are any comments, anything that's coming up in conversation at tables. Any reflections, any questions? Anybody? Back there. It's a long way to get there.
Hello. We talked a little bit about how it's important to kind of use our power and privilege to make sure those who don't have a voice kind of have a place at the table. So making sure to use our privilege kind of for good and make sure that, it's kind of our responsibility too to make sure those that don't necessarily have that voice are able to be that voice, especially in different aspects of the organization, having people from the community on your board, getting their feedback and kind of keeping a good pulse on the community that you're serving.
Great, thank you. Yes. So acknowledging our privilege and also using it wisely. Yes, yes, yes. Anything else? Over here.
Well, one of the things we talked about at the table is just internal power and privilege within the workforce itself, where you work. And I was telling these guys it would be great to have that conversation with our staff because there's such a difference in salary between the people who are on the ground running and managers and executive directors. And some of our family educators are close to food stamps and, really, struggling. And so they're almost like our participants. So I thought it was interesting to you have to look within your organization before you kind of move forward outside. I think it's important to have that conversation, so I might try to bring that up. But we also talked about, getting people of different backgrounds to the table to have the conversations. And that goes back to trust. Because I know we've tried to get a lot of Native American, African American at our table to have discussions about not just food, but health and early learning, and it takes a long time to get them to come, and that goes back to trust and that issue. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comment. There's this phrase that we sometimes use in network building and collaboration, you've got to go slow to go fast. What I don't like about that is it doesn't really tell you much about what you're doing when you're going slow. But that fundamental work of trust building power, making the invisible visible is such important work, right? Such important work. All right. So last year I was able to attend a conference, a philanthropy conference out in Los Angeles. And I was attending this plenary conversation about the values at play in philanthropy. And it was notable because, I don't know if it was the early morning hour or people hadn't had their coffee, but it was really flat. You're talking about values. People were checked out. And then finally, the microphone was given to this gentleman, the Reverend Starsky Wilson, who's at the Deaconess Foundation in St. Louis. Since that conference, Reverend Wilson was appointed co-lead of the Ferguson Commission, which was appointed to help the greater St. Louis community move through all that ensued after the tragic killing of Michael Brown. Well, when the mic was handed to Reverend Wilson, he opened with, I think it's time that we start talking about the prophetic imagination in philanthropy. And suddenly this divinity school graduate was wide awake. I raised my hand immediately. eventually was recognized and said, you know, my organization talks very openly about love as a force for social transformation. And here we are in a room of philanthropists, literally lovers of mankind. So my question is, how are people thinking about love in their work? What's love got to do with it? And like in that room, a few people giggled. What was interesting is suddenly the room came to life. The panel got very animated. And what I remember most was Reverend Wilson's response. When the microphone was handed to him, he said that for him and the communities that he works with, love is what justice looks like in public. Love is what justice looks like in public, which is a quote I think also attributed to Cornel West. He said that it's from the work of our hands, not just what we have in our heads and hearts, that we know, that people know that we love them. So love can definitely be a difficult thing to talk about in public and a hard thing to define. We often know, though, when love is present or when it isn't. What's interesting for me is that in 10 years of working with the Interaction Institute for Social Change, I've noted this progression of how people show up with fewer nervous giggles and smirks on their faces and more knowing nods when I talk about the L word. And I remember a convening I was a part of in Maine a couple of years ago about nutrition in public health. And I was doing a training on collaborative leadership. And so I asked those in attendance, I said, essentially, what's love got to do with your work? And there was this long, punctuated, awkward silence. So just as a facilitation technique, I've learned from research that the most facilitators interrupt silence after about 6 seconds. You got to wait for it. At least 20 seconds. So at about second 19, this very seasoned and senior physician spoke up, clearing his throat. This is a man who's very respected in the state, and he said, love is everything. Love for me is everything. I couldn't teach, I couldn't mentor, I couldn't heal if it weren't for love. Love for me is when you convey that the person in front of you is fundamentally seen. Well, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. What's interesting is that that gentleman's testimony is supported by science. If you haven't checked out her work, Barbara Fredrickson, author of the book Positivity and also Love 2.0, she's a clinical psychologist who's actually devoted her clinical research to how love and other positive emotions can create possibility. She writes, love helps people to expand their outlook. With this broadened mindset, you become more flexible, more attuned to others, more creative. You also become more resourceful. I actually recently read research that shows that positive emotions and love can actually help people transcend own race bias. It actually helps you to see who's right there in front of you. The Chilean system biologist Humberto Maturana has also done research that talks about love in human systems and the evolution of groups. And he notes that love is what supports the impulse and inclination to collaborate in the first place. Love, he writes, is the ability to see the other as a legitimate other. The ability to see the other as a legitimate other. And I find that definition very interesting as it relates to the work for justice. Just a few years ago, my organization didn't talk about love, we talked about respect, and then we made this bold decision to talk more about love in public. But one of the things I miss about respect is that the word literally means to look again. To look again. To not give up. To go beyond first impressions. To not give up on that other person, to not give up on ourselves. And this is something that's so evident for me in the shared leadership of Food Solutions New England and other effective networks that I have the privilege of supporting. I see love and respect in the resilient spirits of Senator Marilyn Moore and tribal leader Vera Francis working on the front lines of their communities, literally fighting for their lives. I see love in Sam the white man sharing his story of unearned privilege and inherited wealth. I see love in the resolve of Brian Donahue and that ever-resilient writing team coming back for more. I see love in the trust and faith of some amazing regional funders who are willing to support a long-term, uncertain, highly emergent process and sitting at the table as peers. Love and trust are what allow that network team to so warmly welcome others and to practice amazing shared and fluid leadership. And it's clear to me that love was present in that room in Burlington, Vermont 3.5 years ago, allowing a small group to see into the emotions of that moment, to see the need and also the opportunity. The point of all of this really is that how we bring ourselves to the work matters. Our interiors matter, not uniquely. I wouldn't want to be understood as saying that it's all about individual responsibility beyond the real structural constraints that many of us deal with. But that said, in my experience, without some kind of deeper resolve and commitment, it is difficult for people to practice collaboration around complex issues and challenging dynamics and sustain it all over the long haul. But the good news is, when you bring love and networks together, cool things can happen. And science is showing this to be true. Networks magnify and spread what we seed them with, including mood, including our outlook. So the question is, what are we sowing? What are you sowing? What signals are you sending out into the ever-interconnected webs of your communities? Given time, I don't want to make this a table conversation. I'm just going to ask you to take just a moment to reflect, to write on these two questions. Where do you notice love in your net and collaborative work? And where is it in you and what you offer? Just 1 minute, silent reflection. So what have we learned? Well, in Food Solutions New England and other networks that I work with, we've learned that practices and structures that build connection and trust are fundamental. That addressing power disparities and privilege is not an option. It's really the hope for any kind of long-term success. We've also learned that what we lead with from the inside matters and will often be reflected back at us in some way. And where do we go from here? In some ways, it feels like we're still at the beginning of this whole network adventure. And in other words, it feels like we've been at this for a very long time. And that shouldn't be surprising, because after all, it is in our nature. We are life. And this road that we're on, this road that we're all on, is a long one. As they say, a marathon, not a sprint. It will continue to have its bumps and torturous turns, especially as we're getting at the root of things, as we deepen trust, as we dig into power, and as we discover our shared humanity. But this is what we've signed up for, right? This is the work that we've signed up for. And it can be difficult, certainly, but it's also rich, full of learning and full of life. Just look around you. You're in very good company here, and have good company for that ride. Thank you very much.